Good morning. Well, thank you for inviting me here today. I didn't really know very much about South San Francisco High School, so I Googled you and found some interesting information. It's wonderful to see such a diverse population. You know, you come from all different ethnic backgrounds, which I think is just wonderful. And I have a lot of interests in sports. Just did this wonderful speech contest where you had some rising stars. You have students that you even honor every month. I think that's very impressive. And then I hit this thing on, said calendar. And then it showed the calendar, and then all of a sudden I saw my name, Karen Korematzu. Oh, I guess I better show up today. So it's wonderful to be here. First of all, I just want to point out to you about the documentary that you just saw, the film clip. I hope you get to see it in its entirety someday. It's also going to be on demand for this month on Comcast. But my brother, I have a younger brother, 4 years younger, that was co-producer. And my mother gave him the challenge about 10 years before the film was completed to do a documentary about my father. There were other documentaries being made at the time. But little did we know that it would take so long, and he would really have to sacrifice his advertising career in order to get it completed. And because he was a part of the film process, that funders found him to be a conflict of interest. They didn't think that he would be able to give and show an objective story. So he brought in his friend Eric Paul Fournier, who is the director that finished the film, and it received 2 Emmys in 2001 for Best Editor and Best Director. So it really means a lot also that my father was able to see it before it was finished. The title of Civil Wrongs and Rights was given by my brother, you know, the wrong being, of course, the wrongful incarceration of Japanese Americans, and then in the end, the right thing the government did by acknowledging that it was wrong with the apology and the reparations in 1988. And with the reparations, it wasn't about the money. Unfortunately, if you want to get someone's attention in Washington, D.C., you usually have to tag on money to it. And because it was more important for the Japanese Americans to receive the apology and to show that the incarceration was unconstitutional. To begin with, I want to tell you a little bit about me. I was born in Oakland Hospital, but grew up in the East Bay and lived in San Leandro, went to San Lorenzo schools. And I went to San Leandro High School. What I'd like to do is ask you just a few questions. Before you started studying about the incarceration and my father, how many people knew about the Japanese incarceration during World War II? Raise of hands. Oh, that's pretty good. How many knew about Fred Korematzu? Oh, good. Then it's a good thing I'm here. Well, actually, I learned about Fred Korematzu and the Japanese incarceration in high school. I was a junior in a social studies class, and our teacher had assigned to us different little paperback books to read. They were on different subjects having to do with American history. And the day that I was supposed to give my oral report, the teacher wanted my friend Maya to give hers first. And the book was called Concentration Camps USA. And she gets up in front of the class and talks about the Japanese American incarceration. And I said, oh, well, that's interesting. I never heard about that. And then she said something about camp. Oh, camp. Well, I remember people talking about camp. And but then, you know, what does camp mean? Camp means usually fun, right? Well, in this case, it wasn't fun. And then she went on talking about this famous Supreme Court case, Korematzu versus the United States. well, Korematzu, that's my name. And I knew that was an uncommon name. And I thought, well, I wonder who this is about. Maybe it's about my father's oldest brother. He, even though he was the firstborn, he ended up to be kind of like the black sheep of the family. And then I thought, well, maybe it was about my grandfather's brother. One of his brothers had been here before World War II, but he had left, and I never knew why. So maybe it was about him. But then I had 35 pairs of eyes turn around and look at me. I was sitting at the back of the room, and I'm lost. What is this all about? And at the end of the class, I asked my friend Maya, well, who is this Korematzu about? And she says, well, I think it's about your father. I said, no, this can't be about my father. Somebody would have told me. So I go home and confront my mother, and she says, yes, this is about your father. And I said, well, why didn't anybody tell me? When were you going to tell me? Well, we, thought maybe by the time you got to college, we would discuss it. You'd be old enough to understand, and besides, you're busy. You've got, Girl Scouts and ballet and all these other school activities, and there was, it just never came up. And she said, well, you'll have to talk to your father. So my father had problems, with employment, and he worked very, very long hours and worked several jobs. And so by the time he got home, it was about 3 hours after I got home from school. And so, I asked him about this, and he said, yes, I decided not to, be with everyone else. He said he felt like what the government did was wrong. He thought it was unconstitutional. He thought what he did was right. And then, of course, he ended up with a felony record all those years. And I could kind of jump up and down and kind of confront my mother, but my father, I didn't. And I could see the pain in his eyes, and I felt like this was something that he just really didn't want to talk about. And the irony to the story is that my brother found out the same way in high school 4 years later. And he said, well, why didn't you tell me? And I said, well, you don't want anything to do with your older sister. You're out playing baseball. You're not interested in anything I have to say. So we thought always that maybe it was just us in our family that no one talked about the incarceration. But when my father's case was reopened in 1983, and then we met all these other Japanese American attorneys, we found out from them that their families had not talked about the incarceration as well. My father, once he was arrested, and how many of you go shopping at Tan Fran Shopping Center? Good. So, did you know it was a racetrack? Good. Did you know it was an assembly, what they called an assembly center for Japanese Americans? Good. Well, that's when, after Executive Order 9066 was issued by President Roosevelt, which in the order really never specifically pointed out to Japanese Americans. But what it did was it gave the military the authorities to force remove the Japanese Americans from the West Coast. So first there was a curfew, and then the orders were given to report to this assembly center, which I call a prison report center, really, because assembly usually means that you gather together voluntarily, and this is an order. So everyone except my father reported there from the Bay Area, and including my grandparents. And I can just imagine, it just breaks my heart when I think about it. Here my grandmother's come over from Japan. She's an immigrant. They wanted to become citizens, but at the time, because of the laws, they couldn't. And she has to pack up everything, in what she can carry in 2 suitcases. They have to sell it, they have to get rid of it, or hopefully people will hold on to it for them. And in some cases, some people did, but in a lot of cases, people thought these Japanese Americans are not coming back, so we might as well just sell their possessions. So they came to Tanforan, and as my father indicated, you know, prison was a lot better than the horse stalls, because they were just whitewashed. They did build additional barracks because there was about 7,800 people that were kind of a holding cell. Had to create their own classrooms, their own medical. Everything had to be more or less, you know, self-sufficient in a temporary way. And they didn't know where they were going. They knew they were going to be transported out, but you know, not to know from day to day, and the rumors must have been a very, very scary, you know, thing to happen. And so after my father's arrest, which was on May 30th, 1942, so it had been only about a month or so since everyone was already at Tanforan, and he had had his first hearing, and then they found him guilty. The judge in San Francisco, you know, sentenced him, and then the ACLU attorneys said, you know, we'll take your case all the way up to the Supreme Court and appeal it. And so then he was sent over to Tanforan along with everyone else. And no one wanted anything to do with him. They had, there was the young men of my father's age got together and had a meeting, and they were trying to decide for him whether he should fight his case or not. Well, it really wasn't up to them. But you know, they thought that some harm would come to them if my father fought this, and everyone just wanted to show that they were all going to be good Americans. But he was vilified. You know, he was treated like the pariah, and basically that's the way it was kind of our entire life. We weren't part of the Japanese American community. You probably know more about the Japanese culture than I do at your age. So it was a very big disconnect. And growing up, my father had experienced some racism. The flower nursery where they lived, the house was next door to the flower nursery in East Oakland. And he tried to go into San Leandro to get a haircut when he was in high school, like you guys. And they refused him. They said, hey, you know, we don't want anything to do with your kind. Go down to Chinatown in Oakland to get your haircut. So can you imagine you go into some barber and you want your haircut and they refuse you just because of your nationality? Then the same thing happened a couple of times when he wanted to go to a restaurant. And they said, no, we don't serve your kind. You know, go someplace else. So all of that kind of was in him, that racism. And in fact, you know, I even experienced racism, and this is after Pearl Harbor, when I was in elementary school. Kids, I mean, it was only maybe 10, 15 years maybe after Pearl Harbor, but kids would, you know, call me Jap. They would say, well, it's your fault for the bombing of Pearl Harbor. It's all your fault. And that's a pretty hard thing to take when you're young, you know, to the point where I didn't even want to ride the school bus. And the same thing happened to my brother. He didn't even want to ride the school bus because he would also face those kinds of racism. So I guess it was kind of understandable why my father felt like he wanted, you know, he wanted to just be an American. He wanted to get on with his life and be here, and just like everyone else. He was the third son of four boys, and the first son always kind of is the shining star, and the second one is the backup. It's a bit like the royal family where you've got the heir and the spare. And the younger one, of course, is the baby, and so he gets doted on all the time. And my father was always kind of given the odd jobs of the flower nursery. He had to do the weeding and the hoeing and, you know, that sort of thing. But he, you know, even though he had a record, he always believed deep down inside that he was right and the government was wrong. Not until his case was opened up in 1983 when Professor Peter Irons and another researcher, Eiko Hertzog-Yoshinaga, found the evidence that there was no military necessity for the Japanese to be incarcerated. That's when I learned that he had always been looking for someone to help him reopen his case, but he just didn't know how to do that. He knew attorneys were expensive, and he just always been hoping. But you know, people would ask him to speak, but he was a very quiet person, and just didn't. He just kept everything inside of him. So when his case was reopened, it was a big risk because he could have lost all over again. He carried that burden with him of the incarceration all those years because he had lost his case at the Supreme Court level. And so he took a risk of reopening his case, and really the young attorneys did as well because they put their careers on the line. And it was really unbelievable that you know he had come so far to finally have his day in court. You know, like Don Tamaki, one of the attorneys, said, it was the day in court the Japanese Americans never had. Then after his case was overturned, then he decided education was what he wanted to do. People wanted to had invited him to speak, and so he went to different schools and universities and law schools, and he found his mission and his focus, because he felt like in order for something like this to never happen again, education was really the key. It's the best weapon we have. You know, it's guns are violence, but you know, education is nonviolent, and we need to really safeguard our civil liberties. And so for his work in education, and also being part of the redress and reparations movement, that's when he received the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Clinton. And I'll tell you a little story with that. One morning, it was I think in December, before the ceremony, which was going to be in January, the phone rings at my parents' house, and my father answers the phone, and they said something about, well, is this Mr. Korematzu? And he says, yes. And they said, well, this is the White House. And he said, oh. And then they said, well, Mr. Korematzu, we would like to give you the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Can you come to the White House on January the 15th? And he said, I don't know, you'll have to talk to my wife. And he passes the phone over to my mother. And so she was a little suspicious too. She thought, is this a joke? Is this a prank? You know, what's going on here? Because you would think somebody would send an official letter from the White House saying, you know, Mr. Korematzu, you're going to be receiving this wonderful award. And it wasn't the case at all. And then we found out that if you want this award and to go to the White House, you have to pay your own way. No one sends you an airline ticket, no one pays for your hotel room, none of that. And my father, this kind of shows you the type of person he was, very, very humble and quiet, and he said, well, just have him send it to me in the mail. Of course, I don't think he realized what the Presidential Medal of Freedom, you know, really meant. And as Mr. Gray said, it's, you know, the highest civilian honor that you can receive in this country. And so we, thanks to the Public Civil Liberties Education Fund that was created as part of the Redress and Reparations movement, they found the money to pay for my father's expenses, and then, you know, our family found the rest of it to go. And it was an unbelievable ceremony, because as you could see, it was at the White House. It was in the East Wing, and it was very formal with the military band, and there was 15 recipients. So they divided the families up into the three rooms of the White House, the blue, 5 families in in the blue room and the green room and the red room. And then the President and Mrs. Clinton came around, and we spent some time talking to them before the ceremony. So they escorted all the recipients out of the room, and then the families came in separately into the east room, and the military escorted all the recipients. And we had behind us, there was like 3 rows of press from all over the world. It was really unbelievable. And President Clinton, as you saw, would read the citations, for each recipient. And it was the only time during the entire ceremony when the press corps stopped and clapped. It was really amazing, very emotional, as you can tell, because they thought what he did was really phenomenal. And he continued to crisscross the United States and talk about his case. Actually, he also received the first California Senate medal from then Attorney General, and Bill was really kind of taken aback because he wanted to be the first one to give my father a medal, but President Clinton had beat him out. In 2009, after my father had passed away, we kind of continued on with some of my father's legacy. You never know what's going to happen after someone passes away, and there was 3 schools that have been named after him in the Bay Area. I don't know if you know that. There's one in East Oakland that you just saw, actually, the Korematzu Discovery Academy, that is actually the elementary school that my father and his brothers went to on the Stonehurst campus. So that was very significant. And there's an elementary school up in Davis, California, and last year we dedicated the 9th grade campus at San Leandro High School. That's named after my father. And then in 2009, I co-founded the Fred Korematzu Institute to carry on his education legacy at the Asian Law Caucus, and Wave Ling Wu Liu is our director. But little did we know at the time that what was in the works was the makings for Fred Korematzu Day. Assemblyman Warren Furutani had, and another assemblyman were working on the bill that was introduced in the California Assembly to name this special day after my father. And this only started last year. So it was introduced in February and signed in September, which was only like 7 months. And they all made it a nonpartisan bill, but it's amazing what government can do in a short period of time when they really want to. And what the significance of the day is the education from kindergarten through, especially through 12th grade and higher education, to not only teach about my father's fight for justice, but to also show how one man can make a difference, but to also talk about the Japanese American incarceration. There was 120,000, people that were incarcerated, and there's 120,000 different stories as well. But also, it brings relevancy to the discussions of the Constitution and our civil liberties today. After 9/11, my father was one of the very first people to speak up, along with the Japanese American community, when the government was starting to talk about maybe rounding up Arab and Muslim Americans and incarcerating them or setting up detention camps with kind of stripping them of their constitutional rights. And certainly, I mean, that's the point of studying history, is hopefully, you won't make the same mistakes, because if you don't learn history, you will be maybe perhaps doomed to make the same mistakes. And So he was always very outspoken. He put his name to 3 amicus briefs, which had to do with the Guantanamo Bay cases of people having, their day in court. And amicus brief means like friends of the court, where it's a supportive petition. And certainly now, I guess you could say the good news is Osama bin Laden has been killed. But the caution is, he may be dead, but terrorism is not. And so we always need to keep that in mind and to be, vigilant in fighting for our civil liberties. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. I'm hoping maybe by the time you get to my age, there's going to be peace in the world, where there won't be any wars, where there won't be any threat. But then I also thought by the time I got to this age that maybe we wouldn't have the racial prejudice that we have today. So it's something that we need to keep fighting for.
All right, thank you very much. I think we have some...
Oh.
I think there's several incredible stories that thread their way through this. The principles of nonviolence, issues of education, not making mistakes again, the power of an ordinary person to do something extraordinary. Fred Korematzu's quote, "Don't be afraid to speak up." I think all these lessons can apply to all of us on a daily basis right here, right now. What I would like to do now is open it up for a question and answer period. I know that a lot of students prepared questions from the work that you've done to prepare to come to this invitational assembly, but also if you have questions that have arisen just from hearing Ms. Korematzu's story or watching the film, all of those questions are available. Here's how I'd like to do it. If you would just raise your hand, and I will call on you, and if you will stand up so that everybody in the room can hear your voice. And then if I could have you maybe repeat the question so that we can get it, and then we would move from there. So, yes, sir. Please stand up.
How far do you think we have come as a society in terms of race and racial prejudice?
The question is how far we have come in society as far as racial prejudice? Well, that's a good question, because it's very debatable on both sides of the coin. I think we have come a little ways as far as I guess having the discussion. And I think that's what's important. We still have racial prejudice, obviously. And I think one thing that I would like to point out is, prejudice is ignorance. So that's why it's important for education to share stories, to share your own stories, to share stories that you've heard. Because sometimes it may be a matter of just one person at a time in order to make a difference. The good thing is I think we have a lot of organizations now, nonprofit organizations of different ethnic groups that are represented. And so at least they are very focused on education of their own ethnic challenges. And whereas back in 1942 that wasn't the case. There weren't even the organizations to help to speak up. That's why why my father did. So it's a matter of, well, we take 3 steps forward and 2 steps back. That's the reality. So it's all up to you and the next generation to keep fighting this.
Great question. Thank you. Other students? Yes, sir. Stand up, please.
What can we do to prevent something like this from happening again?
Okay, I don't know if you heard the question. What can we do to prevent something like this to happen again? Well, my same mantra here is education. And also, another thing that you can do and to think about after you get out of high school and if you whatever careers you get into, is to get involved in your communities. Run for office. If you don't want to run for office, support those who do. Be involved in your local politics and your national politics, and vote. Vote, vote, vote. Because
I push voting.
Oh, we didn't talk before this, really. But people do not think that their individual vote is powerful, and it is powerful. I travel around the world, and we are very privileged in this country to have voting rights. And you even hear some of the atrocities in different countries where they try to keep people away from voting, or they're killed because they want to vote. I mean, at least we don't have that. We still may have issues as far as getting the votes accountable, right? Those Chads that were an issue several years ago, but really, your vote is very important. And when it comes around to voting time, see who needs help voting. Maybe there's older people that can't drive to a voting precinct, and get involved and organize your community, because it does make a difference.
Great, thank you very much. An incredibly important lesson. Yes, ma'am.
How do you feel about the Supreme Court decision on the Korematzu case and the fact that that decision still stands today?
Good question. Her question is, what do I think about the original Supreme Court decision of my father's in 1944, and how it stands today? Because the Supreme Court decision is still what they call, quote, good law. When my father's case was reopened in 1983, they vacated his conviction on a district court level, the Federal Court of Northern California. In order for the case to be kind of wiped off from the Supreme Court record, they would have had to appeal it all the way back up to the Supreme Court. You can't really start at the top, work down. You got to work at the bottom. So because he won on a district level, then there was really no basis for it to be reopened. But the one thing that I want to point out to you, and if you get into law school, this is really a good point of discussion, because what should be recognized that the decision was not unanimous. It was a 6-3 decision. So at the time in 1944, all those Supreme Court judges did not agree. And 3 of those, what they call dissenting opinions, are probably 3 of the most recognized and still discussed today. Justice Jackson, you probably heard this, or maybe even read it. Justice Jackson said, "This lies around like a loaded weapon, ready to be picked up by any authority." Now, you could even, and it was actually discussed, regarding 9/11. So my father's case is still cited today in these issues. At least it's been discredited. So that's the good thing. They really can't use it as precedent, but they certainly have tried. And also, it should be noted that these three dissenting opinions were, 2 of the judges were appointed by Roosevelt. And at the time, you have to realize in 42, no one wanted to go against the president. Right? No one. I mean, we went through this with Bush. No one wants to go through against the president and challenge the president, and because in the end he has the authority. So they even stood up and were courageous in making these decisions, even though they had been appointed.
Excellent question. Thank you very much. Other questions? Try to bounce around to some different classes here. Yes, sir. Stand up, please. Got to hear one more time, or we can't hear you.
I'm sorry, do I have?
You have the courage that your father had. Could you have done what he did?
The question is would I have done what my father did? That's a good question. I mean, what I do is this is what I'm doing. I'm out here talking to all of you and speaking up, and I put my name to two amicus briefs as well, and was challenged because because I think my opinion, this is another good discussion, that Guantanamo Bay is a scapegoat for the United States. You know, they put people there in prison, and then they don't give them their rights. Now, whether they can call them enemy combatants, that's up to the military and to the authorities. But the point being is everyone should have their day in court. Now, this was the situation with the Japanese Americans in 42. As they said, there were no public hearings, there was no due process, there were no trials. They were just thrown into a concentration camp. And I hope, that I would have the same conviction, because I keep telling everyone, don't be afraid to speak up and stand up for your rights. And so I hope as they say, the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree, and I would do the same thing.
Great. I wish that we had a whole lot more time, but we are running out, so I'd like to move to a different part of the program, and I'd like to give, throughout Fred Korematsu's story, he gave a lot to our country. Karen Korematzu continues to give a lot to our country, gives a lot to us right now by sharing their story. So what I'd like to do now is kind of flip it a little bit and take it from a different perspective, and I would like us to have an opportunity, instead of taking the story, to try to give something back to Karen Korematzu and to her family. And so what I would like to ask is, students, if you can come up with what you think would be one word that might describe to you the inspiration, the education, what this story means to you, and if you could say that word, and then maybe give some background as to why you feel that way. Okay, so this is what we call a give back. Yes, sir. All right, stand up. Stand up and explain.
Courage and no hesitation.
And why would you say those two?
Because it would have been hard for someone Japanese to do something like that, especially at the time they were in. It would have been just hard.
So courage?
Yeah.
Let's give him a round of applause. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Inspirational.
Inspirational. She said inspirational.
Yes, ma'am.
I think it's powerful because if he hadn't done what he did, a lot of us minorities still would be going through what your father did.
Powerful.
Powerful.
Stand up, please. Determination.
Determination.
Thank you very much. Can you say it one more time? Sorry.
Hope, because even though we live in a horrible world, it's nice to know that there's some good people out there.
Hope.
Justice, because what your father did really served a lot of people.
Justice. Heart.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
I say he was loyal because not only as a Japanese, he did it not for just himself, but other people that in the concentration camps like him.
Loyal.
Valiant, because in a country that expected him to just fall, he chose to stand back up.
Valiant.
If I had to choose one word to describe Fred Korematzu and the Korematzu family, and this has been said in here before with some of our other guest speakers, but I think it's important to recognize that Fred Korematzu, Karen Korematzu, and their family, they are ordinary people. They are just like you and me. They are ordinary people who were put in an extraordinary situation and rose to the occasion. If you see a wrong, speak up. These are words that we've heard from Fred Korematzu. It could be anybody in this room. It could be, absolutely could be anybody in this room. Not everybody is going to be a King, a Parks, or a Korematzu. But when you see wrong, speak up. And that wrong could be leaving this assembly and you're hearing some language used on this campus. This is your community. This is your school. It's in your family. It's in your state of California. It's in your country. It's your world. I think that some of the lessons that we can draw from the Korematsu is that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. I have one more person I would like to introduce before we close, but can we please give Ms. Karen Korematsu one more time?